This isn't to undermine the amount of extreme hard work that fans and other creators put into creating texture packs. I have nothing but respect towards the talented individuals that put in their hard-earned time and effort to make their favorite games look as good as they can. This video is only my moderately humble opinion and nothing more. I mean no disrespect and only desire to share my particular hot takes on this topic. Okay? So in some of my previous videos, I've alluded to my more obtuse preferences for playing older games, mainly in the realm of emulation. For most players, the consensus for playing on an emulator is usually to crank up all the settings with maxed out resolutions, with all the fancy schmancy texture filtering, anti-aliasing, and other such settings to make those older games look as crisp and as clean as possible. Certainly an understandable preference. After all, we're in the HD age now, and newer generations aren't even going to know that the original standard resolution for decades was 480i, and that HD is still pretty new and wasn't fully adopted until the late 2000s and early 2010s. There was a time when I had that preference. There's an excitement in seeing these older classics viewed in a way never possible before. With the advent of HD re-releases that seek to increase the native output res, this sort of look for older games is becoming more and more common. However, in recent years, my preference has sort of shifted. At this moment in time, when using an emulator, I prefer to keep all the visual settings as vanilla as possible, to attempt to have the game displayed just how it would on an original console. To an extent, because after all, many of these games were originally viewed on an old CRT, and using modern emulators on a CRT ain't exactly the easiest thing to pull off. But with new display technology like external video scalers and hardware mods for many of these old systems, you can get a remarkably clean image on a modern flat HD TV. Preferences will still vary depending on what looks good to you. Personally, I'm a fan of sharp pixels whenever possible and prefer to save a softer look whenever I want to use filters to simulate a CRT. Many old systems like PS1, PS2, N64, GameCube, and Xbox all have options to provide this kind of visual, and it's this kind of sharp pixel output at native resolution that I try to achieve whenever using an emulator. I like playing at the original lower res for a number of reasons. For one, it's simply to stay true to the original look of the game. I know there's a number of interpretations that can be had with a statement like that. For instance, many of these old-ass consoles were mostly played with composite and so would have a much softer image. But since higher quality video was an option via component and RGB SCART cables, and since newer hardware mods don't tamper with the core visuals outside of providing the cleanest possible output, then this sort of sharp pixel look is still fair game to me, and simply viewing at that original lower resolution seems more appropriate for these older games. The main reason why I prefer native res is because I find increasing the res makes visual anomalies more obvious and harder to ignore, makes low polygon models stick out more, and 2D HUD elements gets filtered in an unattractive way, because increasing the native res only affects models most of the time. The texture work and other graphical effects remain mostly untouched, and can, to me, lead to a visually inconsistent experience, especially when there's some sort of filter applied to the textures that make them look even worse. I should stress now that this is nothing more than a glorified nitpick, and it's something that would never actually affect playing the game. I've played many retro game re-releases that end up having these kinds of visuals, and had no problem with it because after all, it's the game that matters most. But in the case of playing on an emulator, then I'd like to keep the resolution and other such settings native to avoid that disparity between the models and textures. And to get it out of the way now, I am also talking about these new decompilation or recompilation projects that have been making the rounds. Decompilation has been a thing for the past few years for a handful of games, but now with N64 specifically, we have recompilation that will revolutionize how retro games are handled on newer hardware. This just popped up while I was making this video, so this part was added in much later. I won't go into it much since it's not the topic of the video, so I'll say my preference stands with these newer versions. I am very happy to see that original resolution, aspect ratio, and frame rate options are here for those who want as OG an experience as possible. At the very least, I'll stick to my OG resolution, but you know, I do fancy native widescreen and higher frame rates. Those have always been finicky with emulators, as widescreen and high frame rates may cause glitches or bugs to materialize. But it seems with these new compiled versions, that wouldn't be an issue anymore. Native gyro is also bomb diggity, and while I am aware of additional lighting tweaks like ray tracing is a thing now for these older games, I'm not sure how I feel about them right now. As far as core visuals go, my preference stands. I like keeping the resolution native to avoid the frankly ugly look of low poly, high res models next to low res, filtered textures. The textures and HUD elements just look more natural at that original resolution. Now I know what you're thinking, because it's been said to me many times at this point. Why not just download a texture pack? Of course. For those unaware, a texture pack is usually a fan-made recreation of a game's texture work to potentially inject more detail into older games without the limitations of the hardware. This also isn't exclusively a fan-only effort, as many official game re-releases usually come with updated textures in one form or another. The main purpose of these textures is to basically fix the problems I have with increasing the native res, by no longer having a distracting disparity between the model clarity and textures. Certainly, for many people, this is the proper solution, as those same people most likely would rather have the game run as high a resolution as possible. But to be completely honest, with a heavy heart, with all the respect and sincerity as possible, I do not like most updated textures for retro games, whether it comes from fans or not. I have my variety of reasons, and it goes without saying that not all texture projects are created equally, but from what I've seen of all the updated texture projects I've witnessed, as well as my own personal taste in game visuals, I'm at a point where I don't bother with HD texture packs. Probably the first reason I have is simply because not every game is even going to have a project dedicated to it to update the game assets. Hell, most of them from what I've dug into aren't even finished, which, I'm sorry if it sounds harsh, but having any, if not most, texture assets left untouched ruins the entire point to me. It would only get further distracting when you're staring at texture work of contrasting clarity. There's also texture updates for more modern games, usually only for the sole purpose of cleaning up what's already there to make the assets look more flattering at higher resolutions. These are harmless, as with updates like these, then you'd probably only see a difference at higher resolutions. I'm still not personally interested in these, as frankly, I don't need the extra clarity. I get all the information I need from the original textures to see what the visuals are going for. With older games, the update in textures gets more drastic. From what I've seen, texture projects seem the most popular for 5th and 6th generation consoles. So you know, the N64, PS1, PS2, GameCube, Xbox, basically any early 3D era games. Updates in sprite-based games aren't that common from what I've seen, but recently there's been some notable works. There are these remastered versions of Zelda and Metroid that run on an emulator and more or less can be described as a texture pack for an NES game. Lots of people seem to really enjoy these and love the visual update, but I'm sorry, I'm not a fan. Respectfully, but I find these drastically updated visuals, still constrained with the limited NES animation, only makes the game look more janky compared to the original graphics. I'm sorry, but when the visual update is this drastic, then I'm only gonna notice the absence of polish in other areas. Like this awkward pop-up after dying, Link not descending into a cave, or the sword beam not flashing. Artistically, it's very inconsistent when you have music and sound effects coming from the original NES versions to Super Nintendo games, analog synth remixes, and GBA games. It all clashes in a way that's not appealing to me. These versions lack identity, and their strengths come from other, better games. Plus, and I'm sorry, and maybe I'm just weird, but when characters and environments from these NES games are portrayed more clearly with these visuals, it takes away the magic of using your imagination to interpret the sprites yourself and let your mind fill in the blanks. Enjoying older games, especially on NES, requires an appreciation of the limited visual knowledge the devs provide to make the visuals come together in your own mind. Redoing an older game's visuals with textures is a task that usually doesn't result in a better visual to me. When people recommend a texture pack to me and I look into it, most of the time I'm not too impressed with the work. And to reiterate and stress, I'm not a graphic designer or a texture artist. I'm just a person with eyeballs with the only ability of being able to tell what looks good to me or not. My problems with these texture packs go from feeling the new textures aren't faithful to the original art style, to thinking the new textures being straight up worse than the original, to simply not seeing much of a difference to begin with. There's this one texture artist that's been recommended to me, and while the work is certainly impressive, there's nothing here that appeals to me personally. I first checked out that Mario Sunshine one, as it's the one I've been recommended the most. most. When I first saw it, I'll admit, I couldn't really tell where the improvement was for the most part. A lot of the newer textures are simply slightly cleaner versions of the older textures, which for a cartoony game like this leaves little impact. Many textures are untouched, leading to quality disparity that's distracting to look at, and when there is extreme detail in some of the textures, it just clashes with the game's art style. To be fair, the higher res model, lower res texture issue I have when playing older games at higher res usually mostly extends to HUD elements. But even here, the HUD, while cleaner, looks worse to me. I miss the black outline on the flood texture. And Mario's face looks terrible, what the fuck? If you find that it is a visual improvement, then that's awesome, and I hope you give it a try. Unfortunately, there are issues not inherent to the texture pack, but can arise when you try to enhance the visuals. Looking at the wiki, you may have to be mindful of how changing various settings can mess with the graphics in the game. In the case of this build, I changed no settings, so any quirks I will put blame on the texture pack, especially when it boasts an easy install, so any more tinkering to fix issues is just a turnoff for any player. The graffiti appears blocky, which can be fixed by turning off scaled EFB copy, which this build isn't defaulted to. Some seriously bad slowdown, which could be a number of things, and I'll take the old heatwave effect over this post-processing haze effect any day. I'm aware many of these can be filled with, but again, any further tinkering outside the initial download install is a massive turnoff for me. Even after all that trouble, there's nothing about this texture update that I'd call an improvement. I'm sorry. There's quite a few games that this creator has done. Twilight Princess is definitely interesting given that it's a more realistically styled game, and that we do have an official HD version to compare. If you watched my video on Twilight Princess HD, then you may already have an idea where I stand on updated textures, even for a more realistically styled game like this one. My main point is that even for a more realistic game like this, the model geometry is still too simple to complement all that extra detail. It makes that simple geometry more jarring to me. It makes repeat tiling more obvious. And straight up, all that detail ends up looking flat and uninteresting to me on all that simple geometry. Or in worst cases, the detail just looks bad. In the spirit of fairness, I can agree that this fan texture work does improve in several areas over the Wii U version, but my core issues are still prevalent, and no amount of post-processing effects are gonna make it better in my honest opinion. Even at higher res, I find the original assets to provide more cohesive visuals. This could simply be a case of the new textures not complementing the art style, but right away at the start, a handful of textures really don't look any better despite all that extra detail. I simply don't need all that extra detail for games this old, as the original assets are more than enough. Recently, I've grown more fond of texture work that's a little more vague and not too detailed. It's amazing how little detail you need to sell a visual with the help of imagination. You can kind of see this by comparing the different versions of Metroid Prime. In many ways, the original actually holds more detail in its texture work than the remaster. I've actually seen several people still prefer the original look because of the more realistic approach to the textures. However, since the remaster has much higher model quality and a more mature approach to textures, it results in updated graphics that are simply unbelievable for the Switch. Good, detailed texture work is almost like a Bob Ross painting. Sure, if you see a texture isolated in a file dump, it will just look like a smudge, but with proper context and blending with other smudges, keeping the detail as restrained and deliberate as possible, results in a picture that beautifully comes together despite the lack of extreme detail. Your mind fills in the blanks and you can see perfectly what everything is supposed to be without the need for said detail. You can't always inject crazy detail in newer textures and expect it to automatically look better. Even in the case of Twilight Princess, I still feel any update to Epona's hair just looks terrible. The original texture has deliberate shading and strokes that meshes with the model to sell this illusion of individual hair strands, and it works surprisingly well, and a lower resolution complements it further. Simply drawing more hair strands in the texture without meshing it well with the simple geometry in the model makes it look straight up bad to me. Devil May Cry 3 has an infamous example of this, where the original less detailed texture allowed for this slick transparency that's quite impressive for a PS2 game and stays consistent with the game's promotional material. The more detailed texture in the HD version has no transparency, and it completely obscures Dante's face and it looks like total shit. This is what I mean by having more detail not being automatically better. Less detail or no, the original asset still looks better, as the artist was able to work around the visual limitations to create textures that even at higher resolutions looks better than the updated textures. See what I mean by an illusion of hair strands being more appealing than simply drawing individual strands? It's visual shortcomings from official remasters like these that make me prefer playing an original release, even if it means sacrificing the precious resolution or widescreen. One of the more unique texture projects I've seen is the Resident Evil Seamless projects you can play via the emulator Dolphin. The older Resident Evil games are interesting with their implementation of pre-rendered backgrounds as the primary source of graphics. This is neat as these backgrounds will inherently have way more detail than what was possible for that hardware, making these games look a generation ahead of the time outside of character models. This even applies to the GameCube titles with Resident Evil Remake and Resident Evil Zero, having completely stunning visuals thanks in large part to these pre-rendered backgrounds. And the series literally wasn't able to catch up to these backgrounds until Resident Evil Village. The problem with the original Resident Evils is that the original source files for these backgrounds are either lost or simply stuck at a low resolution cap. To take Resident Evil 2 for example, the backgrounds can only be displayed at a resolution of 240p, even if you play at a higher native res or on GameCube. The Resident Evil Seamless project seeks to use modern AI interpolation scaling techniques to inject the lost clarity back into these backgrounds. As if you simply play at a higher res, you have this massive juxtaposition of the cleaner looking models against the far lower res backgrounds. It's like my HUD issue on steroids. Since there were higher clarity versions of these backgrounds at some point that are unfortunately lost, this project has a more noble intent to me that I can respect. The results are pretty wild to see, I'm not going to lie. While the original uncompressed backgrounds may still have looked a little different, maybe even better than what we see here, what's being accomplished is still more than impressive. I've always had a kick for this early CG look, and the extra clarity certainly does help the model disparity. This is a case where I can totally recommend playing the classic Resident Evil games in this way, especially if higher res is what you're after. As someone who still prefers playing older games at lower res at the end of the day, then I still prefer to play these classics in that lower res, even with the more compressed backgrounds. The updated ones look amazing, and it's like a lost piece of art being restored. With that said, I kinda like the extra grit and texture the compressing gives. In an odd way, it makes the backgrounds look more realistic to me, and when playing in an OG-like environment with a lower resolution on a CRT or CRT filters, results in more disturbing visuals that enhances the atmosphere of these games to me. When your mind has to fill in the blanks, it'll generate something far scarier than what's actually being shown. Perhaps I'm exaggerating a bit, but I hope you can get what I mean. One thing I want to mention now is the general setup for most of these texture packs. At least in my experience, they can be a bit of a hassle to properly set up, and it seems whenever there's an issue, even after following the instructions to a T, then it'll take scouring ancient forum posts, hoping in vain some other user had the exact same issue, with a potential solution that solved it. I don't mean to sound harsh, I simply want to emphasize how important a simple installation is, because trust me, any additional unclear step is going to steer many people away. There's a similar project for Mario Kart 64 which seeks to replace the original sprites with one so much cleaner that it really does look like 3D character models. This one as well has a more earnest intent behind it, trying to match the original 3D promotional art. When people use the term "looks good as you remember" or something like that, this is what I think of. I don't think that phrase really applies to conventional texture packs, because even when playing on a CRT, the original textures still don't look too much different compared to how they'd look at a higher resolution. Playing on a CRT simply helps you use your imagination to perceive what the texture is. This doesn't mean the texture will magically have more detail, it means you'll have an opportunity to get creative in your mind. Remember this part in AVGN?
You drop bombs on them and that's it. Wait, did I just call that white square a bomb? See, that's using your imagination.
See, that's what I'm talking about. Even when there's nothing explicit about a visual, you can get creative to view what you see in it. There's a few more notable texture projects I'd like to talk about. Neryl's Majora's Mask HD project is a clear example of what any texture project should strive for. An issue that plagues many texture projects is messing with the game's art style too much by plastering artistically inappropriate textures. Neryl's project is extremely noble in that he painstakingly put in the work to match the original art style as much as possible. It could be argued that many of the updated textures don't even look much different to the originals, but I think the difference here is still more striking than redone textures for 6th gen systems. Even Neryl admits that it's a compliment if the texture work looks the same, as it's a testament to how faithful they are. The work pays off because it's very clear Neryl had a deep understanding on how to appropriately update the textures and still have them look good in a higher res environment. Some of my general quibbles still persist, like extreme detail looking flat on simple geometry and repeat tiling being a little obvious. But even with those nitpicks, this texture pack is one of the best in my honest opinion. I understand for the extra clarity like this, it helps realize the imagination of seeing these older textures on newer HD displays. In that application, I can totally get why people would prefer using a texture project like this, as most people nowadays are playing on HD TVs. If I may continue to preach my obtuse preference, however, despite how impressive and commendable even Neryl's project is, I'd still prefer to play with the original assets, thanks to CRT filters being much better nowadays. You have to use RetroArch to use the most advanced ones, but the subpixel replication, HDR support, and black frame insertion does an impeccable job at replicating a real CRT if you don't have a real one available to you. And in the case of playing retro games, that's the sort of visual environment I'd rather play in. Because no matter how much you touch up the textures, add in all sorts of post-processing effects like ray tracing and shit, it's still an N64 game. And no matter what, there will still be visual shortcomings that get more distracting when you touch up the other elements like this. Even stuff like the Render 96 project. It looks amazing. It's extremely cool, and I couldn't be happier to have a version of Mario 64 that looks more like the promotional renders. But even when looking at it, mainly in various enemy and character animations, it's still an N64 game at its core, and the more polished model and texture assets end up making the limited animation work clash a little more to me. It's why I prefer to play these games in an original environment as much as possible. I'm more likely to accept dated visuals if everything is displayed as it originally was. Many of these older games actually have visually aged better than you'd think. I reckon many look down on an original game's visuals because of HD remasters or re-releases that try to update the visuals but only end up making the game look dated as a result, as the game is now being compared visually to modern games with a modern standard. If I play an N64 game, or a PS1 game, or a GameCube game in their original environment, I can more easily accept and ignore any visual shortcomings, and appreciate what they were able to accomplish with the limitations that had to be worked around. There's one final project I'd like to talk about as the apex of texture projects, the Resident Evil 4 HD project. This right here is the cream of the crop of texture packs. This is a project that was a 10-year plus effort to remaster and restore many of the visual assets of the original to produce an upgrade that is genuinely staggering. Like many texture projects, this one spawned from a lackluster official release when Capcom released the original Resident Evil 4 HD on Steam. This version is available on all newer consoles now, with the newer textures being the only option. Most probably won't even notice the updated textures since they leave little impact, and those that do will probably find the new textures to be worse than the original. The Resident Evil 4 HD project seeks to correct all the issues and mistakes of the initial HD release. The mad lads behind it went so far above and beyond, literally traveling the world to find the inspiration of many of the original textures and reworking them in the game with enhanced clarity. They've also straight up found the original uncompressed source files for many of the textures and simply implemented those, which results in upgraded visuals that's far more tasteful to the original. There's also several external post-processing updates as well, Many clashing 2D assets were replaced with high-quality models instead to better complement the higher detail. There are some lighting tweaks you can apply which doesn't interest me much, but for a game like this, it couldn't hurt. I feel Resident Evil 4 is a rare older game that can stand to look better with visual enhancements like this, without presenting all the distracting visual elements I've talked about. Because Resident Evil 4 was released right before the dawn of the next generation, so visually it was basically the peak of what the older generation's hardware could deliver, which is to say, the game still looks really good to this day. Consider also that the game was displayed in a letterbox format, so even when playing on a 4x3 display, the game will still be in widescreen with a smaller frame. So the devs actually sacrificed more resolution to push out better graphics without sacrificing on performance. The game graphically holds up so well that I'd happily play at higher res because it still looks nice to me with the extra clarity. The HD project makes the game look even better too, and it's a very, very, very rare case where I'd wholeheartedly recommend getting it if you have the game on PC. It's so advanced and insane that getting the texture pack will actually up the spec requirements just to run the game. If I'm playing Resident Evil 4 in higher resolution, then this is how I'm gonna do it, which is something I really can't say for most other texture projects. Even in the case of Resident Evil 4, playing the original GameCube release in that smaller letterboxed window still hits differently that no re-release has yet to be able to capture. The atmosphere and creepiness of this game still peaks here in a way that's hard to describe. Sometimes you just can't beat the original window that these games were initially seen through. It's why I'm so insistent on playing games through that window as much as possible. There's an appeal that gets lost when someone tries to fix or improve what was there, just to make an older game keep up with modern standards. It seems recently the age of simple texture updates might be done. For Nintendo at least, it's either the exact same visuals just in HD and widescreen, or completely remaking everything from scratch. If I had just one wish for any official re-release of a game, is the option to simply view it in its original resolution, whether it was 240p or 480. While for many people the solution is updated textures and other assets, I simply enjoy an OG resolution look that I feel is more cohesive to the other graphical assets. Even if you're someone who hates the jaggy pixelated look of original resolution content, then may I suggest using downsampling if it's an option. Personally, I don't care for it much, but downsampling to 240p in this case does make the picture look much cleaner and less jaggy while still maintaining the cohesive look I value when playing at low resolution. It's a great way to keep the detail restrained while making low-res assets look more visually appealing to most people. I'll admit, maybe I don't miss the dithering and texture shimmering from raw low-resolution output, but regardless, no matter what, I'm still for OG res. It's much more interesting to see the original graphics in action and interpreting a few things with my imagination than have all that raw detail on full display and clashing with the other elements. This isn't to completely shut out HD texture packs or those who prefer it. It's all subjective, and everything here has just been my opinion. There's nothing against those who prefer using various graphical enhancements for older games. Whatever it takes you to enjoy a game as much as possible on a visual side is all good to me. But I hope I at least did a good job explaining my unorthodox preference in playing older games, opting from using texture packs and other such tweaks. Literally, the only thing I use reshade for is applying CRT filters for retro re-releases or emulators. All said, I'm not trying to tell anyone how they should play their games. Only wanted to express my take, as I've had many people recommend texture packs that simply don't appeal to me. I would like to express my thanks to those who've tolerated my rambling this whole time. I'm not usually in the business of making rant-style videos, but if I do make more, then they'll probably have a similar tone to this one, if you'd have an interest in seeing that, as I do have a few more ideas. But as far as what the next few videos are going to be, you'll just have to wait and see. Hopefully they won't take too long, but you never know what life will throw at you. With that said, there's nothing more to provide from me today, so the only logical thing left for me to say is thank you for watching.